Okay, great. You should be able to. Hi everyone, welcome back. We had a really great discussion here on this side. I hope you were all able to take a short break and go for a walk and get some oxygen. That's up. Our next three speakers I'm going to quickly introduce, and one of them was not able to join us, but it's very graciously provided us a video of their work. So I'm going to introduce to you very, very quickly our speakers, take a moment to put up their bios. And special thank you to Gabriela for what must be very early in the morning for you. I think navigating these time zones, I think we had someone from Mexico apologize because they didn't realize it was 4 in the morning for them. So I'll start with Gabriela Carolini, who is an associate professor of urban planning and international development in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she leads the City Infrastructure Equity Lab and co-chairs the planning doctoral program. Her teaching and research center on equity in the governance and planning of infrastructure development across urban communities in the Americas and Africa. Her work on urban infrastructure and international development has been published as a book, Equity, Evaluation and International Cooperation, with Oxford University Press, and her award-winning articles can be found in leading journals, including Environment and Planning, Economy and Space, International Journal of Urban and Regional Studies, Research Urban Studies, Journal of the American Planning Association, and many, many more. We will also be joined by Tanzil Shafiq, who is a lecturer of urban design and co-director of the postgraduate program at the University of Sheffield School of Architecture. He is also an associate of the Urban Institute and previously has taught at the University of Melbourne, University of Arkansas, and Tanzil's research looks at southern urbanism and informal planning design, mainly around the ongoing adaptation and transformations due to climate change by local citizens. And online we'll be joined by Dr. Soraya Sheva, and Soraya is a lecturer in Environment and Geographical Science Department at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He's interested in contemporary urban challenges, governance, and related struggles to reimagine and remake just urban features. She's explored this wider interest with 2 more focused strands of work, urban water and urban housing. Since 2020, she's been engaged in comparative projects and land building occupations in Cape Town, Bogota, and Sao Paulo. So we're going to start with Soraya's downloaded video, which hopefully she might even give us permission to share.
Share my screen, is it?
Video. And as you know, there's always problems with videos.
Just let me know if the sound works, please. Because that screen is gone. That's one. Hi everyone. A screen that worked until 2 seconds ago is just suddenly died on us. Okay. But the sound.
It's sound, it was sound.
Just going to stop sharing the slide again.
Okay, you know what, Gabriela, would you mind starting? And we'll propagate out the sound. So we'll hand over to you, and you're welcome to share your screen while we figure this out.
Sounds good. And apologize in advance, but I will have a small child likely joining us within my talk, and you'll see me sweating lots after my talk because I'll be walking outside bringing him to camp. So apologies in advance for that. And let me try. I could just measure that to find the PowerPoint. Like Gautam, I fear Microsoft Teams, but I will try my best. Ay, que Dios. Here we are. Okay. Does this work? Can you see that?
We can.
Are you okay? You can. Okay. So, number one, thank you for for inviting me to join you all in this discussion.
My sound stopped working.
Can you hear me still?
I don't know why we can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Oh, I can give you control. Can you hear me now?
It might be on our side. Give us that.
Can you hear me or no?
Will autonomy promote theory and praxis defined by active emergent thinking rather than distant critical observation of complex and messy life worlds? The common imperative here is really to bridge gaps.
Okay, so somehow we figured out the sound from the previous one, but
Sorry.
lost Gabriella's sound.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Let's try this.
Can you?
We can hear you, Gabriela.
Thank you, Catalina. Thank you.
Sorry, everyone. Bear with us. It's all.
I can't see.
Okay, Gabriella,
You tell me when to go, and I will go.
Sorry, everyone. The trouble is that we couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, I know that you're talking, but I cannot hear you. So.
Okay. Catalina could not.
Maybe we have problem of the hybrid format, right? That us that are online, I think.
Okay. Catalina, you can hear me. It's just that
Yes,
they can't. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I thought I was going crazy.
Let's give them 1 minute. I'll text them and see what's going on with it.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Gabriella, can you try to speak?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Be good.
Okay. All right. Okay. And you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see if I can go back and see my screen. Hold on. If I move this way, do you see that? Do you see the move? Yes. You do. Okay. So, all right. I'm going to try. So let me minimize the sidebar. I will say thank you again for having me, and I will try my best to go through this quickly so we can get to a more interesting discussion. But of course, you know, the theme of Southern values in action has essentially animated much of my career for the past decade. It's essentially behind the book that Jono mentioned that I finally published after too many years of long research, which was centered on examining, you know, exactly how different is South-South cooperation? Is Southernism, in effect, a value that is distinct from other types of cooperation or other types of partnerships? So these were familiar, motivating questions for me, the ones that you have all been grappling with, and I'm happy in a way that we're all struggling with the same thing. It speaks to essentially an arrival at a shift in how we approach questions, certainly within the Planning Academy. I know many of you are in architecture and design as well, but of course this overlapping of critical development studies and professions within the built environment. So I'm happy to see this, the critical questioning. Again, it motivated my own life and research, and in particular, what I worked on in this book was examining whether who a city or with whom a city partners with matters as South-South enthusiasts, including ourselves, might have us think. And, you know, I say ourselves because when I began doing this research, I really wanted there to be a Southern specific value set. And so the questioning began, again, for me over a decade ago, when lots of these types of images really were centered in international relations discussions and centered in work that I was doing in Brazil and in Mozambique in particular. So it was in early 2011. The UN even embraced South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, so much so in a way that essentially every type of cooperation became part of the norm that should be prioritized and advanced, and there was not, from my perspective, a real critical thinking of what this means in practice. And as a planner, I am very interested in this marriage of theory and practice. For a while, I worried that my book took too long to come out, and so I was relieved in a way in 2022 when I still saw the rhetoric of South-South cooperation, the rhetoric of Southern values in action, still at the forefront of many discussions, certainly within the COVID pandemic. So exactly, what are Southern values? I know you guys have been talking about this a lot through the seminar, and again, I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. When I looked at, what exactly were the claims, this is the type of, these are the types of terms that came up. So the idea of a genuine solidarity, equality, mutual respect, mutual benefit. But by the same measure, when I was on the ground in Mozambique, essentially every year looking at different cooperation projects, I came across this kind of imagery where essentially Brazil, which was a cooperation partner in Mozambique and is still a cooperation partner in Mozambique across several different sectors and scales of work, was really questioned for its growing quote unquote imperialism. And that complication, of course, is reflected in the discourse that you have all been having about whether or not Southernism is the right way to be thinking about it, the idea of the North and the South and all of these dichotomies not being essentially as nuanced as we need in terms of advancing equity in practice. So the question I was left with in a very unsatisfactory way in my own work is, okay, great. So if we can't even count on Southernism as a good proxy for what is good, for what we want, for our aspirations, in urban development work in particular, how are we ever going to understand whether what we're doing is actually advancing equity in practice? How do we begin to understand? So that is the question that I end up focusing on in my book that started out as a inquiry into Southern practice. And where I arrived at was looking at evaluations. And realizing that much of the work in evaluation centers a logic of efficiency over a logic of equity, particularly at the level of project work. And project work is what many of us do within the built environment. And of course, trying to juxtapose that kind of prioritization of efficiency, I try to think about, what does equity mean in practice? How do we operationalize equity? And looking at several literatures, across the board and looking at practice over 6 or 7 decades of work within development as a formal industry of practice, we find that issues of distributive justice and epistemic justice have really not gained as much traction as perhaps procedural justice, which is kind of core to what planners claim to say is really critical at the project level. So in my work, I tried to look at projects within the water and sanitation space to understand whether distributive justice, procedural justice, and epistemic justice were evident. And if we could use those 3 criteria as a way of really understanding whether or not in practice are we advancing towards the aspiration of what Southernism or Southern values claim to aspire towards in action. And again, I think it reflects much of the discussion of the commons or consensus that this group is already very familiar with. So again, I asked myself, could I do things differently in my own research examining water and sanitation? Could I go beyond looking at procedural benefits? Could I go beyond looking at, was there participatory action in this research? Was there participation? Was there participatory parity? among different beneficiaries in a water and sanitation project, to looking at the actual distribution of material benefits, to looking at the quality of material benefits that came out of different development projects, to looking importantly at the learning and knowledge production within projects, whether there was a recognition of different knowledge typologies, whether the quality of learning actually mattered within cooperation projects. All of those things seem to me really critical questions that spoke to at least what we say we want in terms of Southern practices and values therein. Going here. If I had to be an academic and call it something, I'm forced to say something as absurd sounding as a situated prioritarianism, which is just awful as as a coupling of words. But I'm trying to be brief. But essentially, what that means is taking a philosophy of prioritarianism and giving a situated knowledge priority of place in identifying the well-being of the least well-off, with whether that's within a specific community, a neighborhood, a sector like water in which I work and sanitation, or it be some other definition. But the situatedness being a prioritization of local knowledge, of lived experience, and again, thinking through, well, how do we even begin to make change within the built environments? How do we begin to operationalize equity, and who should be prioritized first? And that's, of course, a very, very complicated question. How do we begin to define well-being? How do we begin to decide together who is quote unquote least well off? What does being well off or well-being actually mean? And to get there, I really, in my research and in my more action-oriented research, find that we as practitioners need to really balance the ideas of patience and urgency. Patience in the sense that there's a lot of time that's required to first ask questions about, well, how is well-being understood? By whom? When? Where? Who is well off? Who is least well off? Understood by whom, when, where, and in which way? And most critically, who disagrees? Because if we focus only on consensus building and participation, then we're missing fault lines that are really illegible to us as practitioners. And I think, again, many of the readings that you've already done speak to this idea of the illegibility of consensus, of disagreements on the ground when we're engaged in planning projects and design projects. From a practitioner perspective, it also means dealing with issues of scale and persistently questioning the benchmarks and frameworks that we use in practice to evaluate, are we advancing? So again, how is equity operationalized? How do we actually make it real and not just talk about equity? What does that look like materially? What does it sound like experientially? And how do we, quote unquote, know anything is real? At what scales are reforms required? These are, again, nature of questions that I think are really important. Again, I was lucky, thank you, Jonah, for sharing the summary of discussions that you've all been having. And I agreed with so much of what came out of your discussions. One of the things that I think, or rather two words that pop up in my mind, are issues of scale and time and politics in essentially engaging with the idea of Southern practices. And so scales are required in thinking through how to bring more equity into operations, because of course we're all working within different frameworks, and we're always pointing at some place. Oh, well, we need to use this framework because XYZ said so, right? Or we don't have the politics in place to prioritize this change because the tanks will come rolling in. So I think, again, from a practitioner's perspective, we need to engage with politics that prioritize change, and as my old advisor used to say, expose, propose, and politicize that change. And as academics, we're very good at exposing as design to see the changes that we would like to see in terms of equity. So a very, very, very brief example, again, from my own work, and in particular this book. The object of my particular scorn is evaluations within development cooperation. So I took a very specific lens and examining what evaluations look like on the ground. Is in no way, when I started my work, when I was also a doctoral student, or even after being a doctoral student, in no way were the values that I aspired to, this kind of Southern values in action, in no way were they going to be upheld or recognized with the orthodox evaluations that exist at the project level. It is an uphill value for the values of equity to be extolled. It's not happening. Instead, what we get are the quantification of results, right? This logic of efficiency that really drives quote unquote development practice, that drives the built environment practices, and so on and so forth. So here is a screenshot of one of the project evaluation reports that was coming out of one of several World Bank funded projects within the city of Maputo in Mozambique. But as academics, we don't do much better very often. We also center efficiency when we're examining aid and cooperation in a way that really doesn't give very much equitable room to equity in conceptualizing what it means to make progress. So in terms of, I'm sorry that my attempt at animation isn't working here, but so let me maybe take out the big X. A new architecture of evaluation. So if all of those things are awful, like I'm saying, what exactly can we do? There's been a lot of work done on, how do you improve cost-benefit analysis? What is cost-benefit analysis, or how cost-benefit analysis is still the only way to examine things within projects? There's, of course, a lot of work that looks at SWOT analysis, or strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And, being in the belly of the beast at MIT, of course, I'm very familiar with randomized controlled trials as well, which is the far right image you'll see, this idea of, a gold standard of understanding the average effect of an intervention. All of those things sound great, but the reason I had the big red X there is that none of them reflect the centering of equity in a way that I would like to see done in evaluations of project level work. There has been a little bit of work to advance the idea of learning within evaluation. So this comes from USAID of all places. But even their focus on moving from monitoring, evaluation to monitoring and evaluation and learning still positions learning as a very efficient exercise, right? So the things you learn, did you learn A, B, and C? It's about accountability, and it's about an epistemic injustice in terms of who gets to learn what and who gets to decide what is valuable to learn. So again, in my work, I've tried to understand what are the different types of knowledge and learning typologies that would be relevant? How do we move from single loop learning, where you're essentially told what you should learn and tested on it, and if you don't get it right, you fail, through double loop learning, which is, you take a test, you don't get things right, and maybe you question, was it the right question for me to begin with? That's a little bit better than single loop learning, to triple loop learning, which is really much more metacognitive, and thinking about, well, how exactly do I best learn? Whether that's in a project or within our own careers as researchers and students of the built environment. And again, what I found in my work was that evaluations as currently used really ignore the more contextualized knowledge that is critical to what I would call the higher levels or higher values of learning that are centered on procedural and metacognitive thinking. So it's very easy for everyone to get the factual, generalizable types of technology or practices within a cooperation project. But learning about procedural and metacognitive ways of thinking, you know, what's best for me and why is a very different ballgame. How do I advance this within my own practice? And I swear this is the last slide. I will just speak to the idea of speaking to power. So I took all of this work that I was doing, and I was really scared because I had to present it on a panel with the IMF and the World Bank. And this was very interesting for me as an intellectual exercise, but it was also important in terms of advancing the idea that the quality of learning and equity in and of itself was just as important a criteria for development cooperation projects as other issues. And I will say on this panel, I was giving this kind of talk on evaluation and the quality of learning, and the folks from the IMF and the World Bank were giving talks that centered on things that you'll see more on the right-hand side of my screen about their FDI flows and industry and destination and different ways of quantifying the work that they've been doing. And so it remains an uphill battle, but to speak to earlier discussions you've been having already, the idea of socializing a different way of thinking is beginning to take place within evaluation. And certainly there's much more questioning, even though, of course, the quote unquote gold standard of policy level or program evaluations remains very much centered on a logic of efficiency. I'm hoping that more and more folks, including many of you, will take up the challenge of really questioning how we evaluate, how we know we're actually doing the work that we think needs to be done. And we, of course, being something that can be questioned and decentralized or decentered rather. And I'll stop with that and just say thank you. And how do I stop sharing my screen? This is a challenge.
Stop engaging. Stop engaging.
Yes. How do I stop engaging? I can't. Oh, there. Stop sharing. Great. But thank you. Thank you. Was my timing okay? Okay, thank you guys. I'm going to be moving around, Jonas, so I'm going to hide myself, but I will be listening and such, but thanks.